Harvest time with beavers. One autumn I watched a beaver colony and observed the customs of its primitive inhabitants as they gathered their harvest for winter. It was the spruce tree colony, the most attractive of the 16 beaver municipalities on the big moraine on the slope of Long's Peak. The first evening I concealed myself close to the beaver house by the edge of the pond. Just at sunset, a large, aged beaver of striking patriarchal appearance rose in the water by the house and swam slowly, silently round the pond. He kept close to the shore and appeared to be scouting to see if an enemy lurked near. On completing the circuit of the pond, he climbed upon the end of a log that was thrust a few feet out into the water. Presently, several other beaver appeared in the water close to the house. A few of these at once left the pond and nosed quietly about on the shore. The others swam about for some minutes and then joined their comrades on land, where all rested for a time. Meanwhile, the aged beaver had lifted a small aspen limb out of the water and was squatted on the log, leisurely eating bark. Before many minutes elapsed, the other beavers became restless and finally started up the slope in a runway. They traveled slowly in single file, and one by one vanished amid the tall sedge. The old beaver slipped noiselessly into the water, and a series of low waves pointed toward the house. It was dark as I stole away in silence for the night, and Mars was gently throbbing in the black water. This was an old beaver settlement, and the numerous harvests gathered by its inhabitants had long since exhausted the nearby growths of aspen, the bark of which is the favorite food of North American beaver, though the bark of the willow, cottonwood, alder, and birch is also eaten. An examination of the aspen supply, together with the lines of transportation, the runways, canals, and ponds, indicated that this year's harvest would have to be brought a long distance. The place it would come from was an aspen grove far up the slope, about a quarter of a mile distant from the main house, and perhaps 120 feet above it. In this grove I cut 3 notches in the trunks of several trees to enable me to identify them, whether in the garnered pile by a house or along the line of transportation to it. The grounds of this colony occupied several acres on a terraced, moderately steep slope of a mountain moraine. Along one side rushed a swift stream on which the colonists maintained 3 but little-used ponds. On the opposite side were the slope and summit of the moraine. There was a large pond at the bottom, and 1 or 2 small ponds, or water-filled basins, dotted each of the 5 terraces which rose above. The entire grounds were perforated with subterranean passageways or tunnels. Beaver commonly fill their pools by damming a brook or a river, but this colony obtained most of its water supply from springs, which poured forth abundantly on the uppermost terrace, where the water was led into one pond and a number of basins. Overflowing from these, it either made a merry little cascade or went to lubricate a slide on the short slopes which led to the ponds on the terrace below. The waters from all terraces were gathered into a large pond at the bottom. This pond measured 600 feet in circumference. The crooked and almost encircling grass-grown dam was 6 feet high and 400 feet long. In its upper edge stood the main house, which was 8 feet high and 40 feet in circumference. There was also another house on one of the terraces. After notching the aspens, I spent some time exploring the colony grounds and did not return to the marked trees until 48 hours had elapsed. Harvest had begun, and one of the largest notch trees had been felled and removed. Its gnawed stump was 6 inches in diameter and stood 15 inches high. The limbs had been trimmed off, and a number of these lay scattered about the stump. The trunk, which must have been about 18 feet long, had disappeared, cut into lengths of from 3 to 6 feet probably, and started toward the harvest pile. Wondering for which house these logs were intended, I followed, hoping to trace and trail them to the house or find them en route. From the spot where they were cut, they had evidently been rolled down a steep, grassy, 70-foot slope. At the bottom of this dragged an equal distance over a level stretch among some lodgepole pines, and then pushed or dragged along a narrow runway that had been cut through a rank growth of willows. Once through the willows, they were pushed into the uppermost pond. They were taken across this, forced over the dam on the opposite side, and shot down a slide into the pond which contained the smaller house. Only 48 hours before, the little logs which I was following were in a tree, and now I expected to find them by this house. It was good work to have got them here so quickly, I thought, but no logs could be found by the house or in the pond. The folks at this place had not yet laid up anything for winter. The logs must have gone farther. On the opposite side of this pond, I found where the logs had been dragged across the broad dam and then heaved into a long, wet slide, which landed them in a small, shallow harbor in the grass. From this point, a canal about 80 feet long ran around the brow of the terrace and ended at the top of a long slide which reached to the big pond. This canal was new and probably had been dug especially for this harvest. For 60 feet of its length it was quite regular in form and had an average width of 30 inches and a depth of 14. The mud dug in making it was piled evenly along the lower side. Altogether, it looked more like the work of a careful man with a shovel than of a beaver without tools. Seepage and overflow from the ponds above filled and flowed slowly through it and out at the farther end, where it swept down the long slide into the big pond. Through this canal the logs had been taken one by one. At the farther end I found the butt-end log. It probably had been too heavy to heave out of the canal, but tracks in the mud indicated that there was a hard tussle before it was abandoned. The pile of winter supplies was started. Close to the big house, a few aspen leaves fluttered on twigs in the water. Evidently, these twigs were attached to limbs or larger pieces of aspen that were piled beneath the surface. Could it be that the aspen which I had marked on the mountainside a quarter of a mile distant so short a time before, and which I had followed over slope and slide, through canal and basin, was now piled on the bottom of this pond? I waded out into the water, prodded about with a pole, and found several smaller logs. Dragging one of these to the surface, I found there were 3 notches in it. Evidently, these heavy green cuttings had been sunk to the bottom simply by the piling of other similar cuttings upon them. With this heavy material in the still water, a slight contact with the bottom would prevent the drifting of accumulated cuttings until a heavy pile could be formed. However, in deep or swift water, I have noticed that an anchorage for the first few pieces was secured by placing these upon the lower slope of the house or against the dam. Scores of aspens were felled in the grove where the notched ones were. They were trimmed, cut into sections, and limbs, logs, and all taken over the route of the one I had followed, and at last placed in a pile beside the big house. This harvest gathering went on for a month. All about was busy, earnest preparation for winter. The squirrels from the treetops kept a rattling rain of cones on the leaf-strewn forest floor. The cheery chipmunk foraged and frolicked among the withered leaves and plants, while aspens with leaves of gold fell before the ivory sickles of the beaver. Splendid glimpses, grand views I had of this strange harvest home. How busy the beavers were! They were busy in the grove on the steep mountainside. They tugged logs across the runways. They hurried them across the water basins. wrestled with them in canals, and merrily piled them by the rude house in the water. And I watched them through the changing hours. I saw their shadowy activity in the starry, silent night. I saw them hopefully leave home for the harvest groves in the serene twilight, and I watched them working busily in the light of the noonday sun. Most of the aspens were cut off between 13 and 15 inches above the ground. A few stumps were less than 5 inches high, while a number were 4 feet high. These high cuttings were probably made from reclining trunks of lodged aspens, which were afterward removed. The average diameter of the aspens cut was 4½ inches at the top of the stump. Numerous seedlings of an inch diameter were cut, and the largest tree felled for this harvest measured 14 inches across the stump. This had been laid low only a few hours before I found it, and a bushel of white chips and cuttings encircled the lifeless stump like a wreath. In falling, the top had become entangled in an alder thicket and lodged 6 feet from the ground. It remained in this position for several days and was apparently abandoned, but the last time I went to see it, the alders which upheld it were being cut away. Although the alders were thick upon the ground, only those which had upheld the aspen had been cut. It may be that the beaver which felled them looked and thought before they went ahead with this cutting. Why had this and several other large aspens been left uncut in a place where all were convenient for harvest? All other neighboring aspens were cut years ago. One explanation is that the beaver realized that the tops of the aspens were entangled and interlocked in the limbs of crowding spruces and would not fall if cut off at the bottom. This and one other aspen were the only large ones that were felled, and the tops of these had been recently released by the overturning of some spruces and the breaking of several branches on others. Other scattered large aspens were left uncut, but all of these were clasped in the arms of nearby spruces. It was the habit of these colonies to transfer a tree to the harvest pile promptly after cutting it down. But one morning I found logs on slides and in canals, and unfinished work in the grove, as though everything had been suddenly dropped in the night when work was at its height. Coyotes had howled freely during the night, but this was not uncommon. In going over the grounds, I found the explanation of this untidy work in a bear track and numerous wolf tracks, freshly molded in the muddy places. After the bulk of the harvest was gathered, I went one day to the opposite side of the moraine and briefly observed the methods of the island beaver colony. The ways of the two colonies were in some things very different. In the spruce tree colony, the custom was to move the felled aspen promptly to the harvest pile. In the island colony, the custom was to cut down most of the harvest before transporting any of it to the pile beside the house. Of the 162 trees that had been felled for this harvest, 127 were still lying where they fell. However, the work of transporting was getting underway. A few logs were in the pile beside the house, and numerous others were scattered along the canals, runways, and slides between the house and the harvest grove. There was more wasted labor, too, in the island colony. This was noticeable in the attempts that had been made to fell limb-entangled trees that could not fall. One 5-inch aspen had 3 times been cut off at the bottom. The third cut was more than 3 feet from the ground, and was made by a beaver working from the top of a fallen log. Still this high-cut aspen refused to come down, and there it hung like a collapsed balloon entangled in treetops. Prowling hunters have compelled most beaver to work at night, but the spruce tree colony was an isolated one, and occasionally its members worked and even played in the sunshine. Each day I secluded myself, kept still, and waited, and on a few occasions watched them as they worked in the light. One windy day, just as I was unroping myself from the shaking limb of a spruce, I saw 4 beaver plodding along in single file beneath. They had come out of a hole between the roots of the spruce. At an aspen grove about 50 feet distant, they separated. Though they had been closely assembled, each appeared utterly oblivious to the presence of the others. One squatted on the ground by an aspen, took a bite of bark out of it, and ate leisurely. By and by he rose, clasped the aspen with forepaws, and began to bite chips from it systematically. He was deliberately cutting it down. The most aged beaver waddled near an aspen, gazed into its top for a few seconds, then moved away about 10 feet and started to fell a 5-inch aspen. The one rejected was entangled at the top. Presently the third beaver selected a tree, and after some trouble in getting comfortably seated or squatted, also began cutting. The fourth beaver disappeared, and I did not see him again. While I was looking for this one, the huge, aged beaver, whose venerable appearance had impressed me the first evening, appeared on the scene. He came out of a hole beneath some spruces about 100 feet distant. He looked neither to the right nor to left, nor up nor down, as he ambled toward the aspen growth. When about halfway there, he wheeled suddenly and took an uneasy survey of the open he had traversed, as though he had heard an enemy behind. Then, with apparently stolid indifference, he went on leisurely, and for a time paused among the cutters, which did nothing to indicate that they realized his presence. He ate some bark from a green limb on the ground, moved on, and went into the hole beneath me. He appeared so large that I afterward measured the distance between the two aspens where he had paused. He was not less than 3.5 feet long and probably weighed 50 pounds. He had all his toes. There was no white spot on his body. In fact, there was neither mark nor blemish by which I could positively identify him. Yet I feel that in my month around the colony I beheld the patriarch of the first evening in several scenes of action. 67 minutes after the second beaver began cutting, he made a brief pause. Then he suddenly thudded the ground with his tail, hurriedly took out a few more chips, and ran away, with the other two beaver a little in advance, just as his 4-inch aspen settled over and fell. All paused for a time close to the hole beneath me, and then the old beaver returned to his work. The one that had felled his tree followed closely and at once began on another aspen. The other beaver, with his aspen cut half off, went into the hole and did not again come out. By and by an old and a young beaver came out of the hole. The young one at once began cutting limbs off the recently felled aspen, while the other began work on the half-cut tree, but he ignored the work already done and finally severed the trunk about 4 inches above the cut made by the other. Suddenly the old beaver whacked the ground and ran, but at 30 feet distant he paused and nervously thumped the ground with his tail as his aspen slowly settled and fell. Then he went into the hole beneath me. This year's harvest was so much larger than usual that it may be the population of this colony has been increased by the arrival of emigrants from a persecuted colony down in the valley. The total harvest numbered 443 trees. These made a harvest pile 4 feet high and 90 feet in circumference. A thick covering of willows was placed on top of the harvest pile. I cannot tell for what reason, unless it was to sink all the aspens below reach of the ice. This bulk of stores, together with numerous roots of willow and water plants, which are eaten in the water from the bottom of the pond, would support a numerous beaver population through the days of ice and snow. When I took my last tour through the colony, everything was ready for the long and cold winter. Dams were in repair and ponds were brimming over with water. The fresh coats of mud on the houses were freezing to defy enemies, and a bountiful harvest was home. Harvest gathering is full of hope and romance. What a joy it must be to every man or animal who has a hand in it. What a satisfaction, too, for all dependent upon a harvest, to know that there is abundance stored for all the frosty days. The people of this wild, strange, picturesque colony had planned and prepared well. I wished them a winter unvisited by cruel fate or foe, and trusted that when June came again, the fat and furry young beavers would play with the aged one amid the tiger lilies in the shadows of the big spruce trees.